seconds. And over the mic is all fueling to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha. Stand by, camera one.
I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera. Go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture. Hello, I'm Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and tonight we talk for the hour with one man in a special edition of Conversations with Great Minds. As the situation with ISIS in the Middle East continues to grow, more and more people are debating the role that extremism plays in the religion of Islam. One of the most recent heated debates over the issue came on an episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, where Maher, author Sam Harris, Ben Affleck, and author Nick Kristof got into a heated argument after Maher and Harris basically claimed that Islam and extremism are one and the same. Take a look.
And we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to
okay.
criticize bad
But
ideas.
Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have
That's
ideas
just a
like
fact.
blasphemy.
It's an ugly thing.
Apostasy.
It is
one basic liberal
well, let me
principle
unpack
of
it.
tolerance.
Let me unpack it.
But not for intolerance.
No, of course not. But the picture you're painting is, to some extent, true, but is hugely incomplete. It is certainly...
Kristof is right. While the real-time debate touched on many things, it left a fairly incomplete picture when it comes to the nature of the world's second largest religion. So tonight, let's try to complete that picture and dive more into the religion of Islam. Joining me now from our Los Angeles studio for a special edition of Conversations with Great Minds is one of the most thoughtful and respected experts on both Christianity and Islam, Reza Aslan, professor, religious scholar, and author of several books, including No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, and his most recent, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Reza, welcome back to the program.
It's a pleasure to be back on the show. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. You've been at the center of a lot of this controversy, including the controversy surrounding Bill Maher and the so-called new atheist critique of Islam. How do you respond to that dialogue that has kind of gone viral and the perhaps more importantly the meta positions behind it?
Well, I think it's an indication of just how passionate the subject of religion is in the United States. I mean, one thing that I always try to remind people is that when we're talking about religion, we're not just talking about the things that people believe or the rituals that they practice. We're talking about their very identities. Religion is wrapped up in who you are as a human being, how you understand your place in the world. It's inextricable from the other factors of your identity, like your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, your sexual orientation. And so when the topic of religion comes up, we shouldn't be surprised that what we see are these kinds of impassioned, if perhaps somewhat simplistic responses from all sides of the argument.
Yeah, well, and somewhat simplistic is, I think, the key here. I think it's really important to take the conversation beyond that. When people like Sam Harris, for example, attack Islam, they often point to last year's Pew study of the Islamic world. From the Western point of view, that study showed some pretty shocking stuff, like how 86% of Egyptians and 76% of Pakistanis support the death penalty for apostasy. I always mangle that word, but
for apostasy, yeah.
Apostasy. Thank you. How should we interpret this study and others like it?
Well, first of all, those numbers are incorrect. It's actually 64% of Egyptians who support the death penalty for apostasy, which is outrageously high. But it's also not very instructive, either about Egypt or about the larger Muslim world. For instance, in neighboring Tunisia, the number is like 11%. In Lebanon, it's about 10 or 9%, I believe. In Turkey, I think it's less than 5%. So what some Egyptians believe is not instructive of the larger Muslim world, but it's even more complicated than that, because the exact same poll that showed that 64% of Egyptians favor the death penalty for apostasy from Islam also indicated that 75% of Egyptians want full religious freedoms for all Egyptians in the country. And if that sounds like a contradiction, that's because it is a contradiction. What I think that the new atheists, or just these sort of simple knee-jerk criticisms of religion don't seem to understand is the difference between the sort of theoretical conception or scriptural conception of religion and religion as a lived experience, which is full of complexities and contradictions, quite radical differences in the way that people actually think, the way that we think people live their lives and the way that they actually live their lives. And so, in a sense, it's not just incomplete or disingenuous to take a single poll like that and make some broad statement about Muslims in general. It's also, I think, a misunderstanding of what religion actually is and how people actually experience religiosity in their lives. And, frankly, the enormous contradictions between the things that they say and the things that they do, the things that they believe and the actions that they take based on those beliefs.
I've debated over the years both Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins on religion, and what struck me in both cases was their absolute reliance on rationality and logic, without acknowledging the limitations of rationality and logic. I mean, if we were 200 years ago and somebody set a modern-day radio in front of you, or even a germanium crystal and a cat whisker, and said, someday I can pull sounds out of the sky from this, people would go, no, that's not even possible. I mean, there's so much that we don't know, that, and that doesn't have to be the argument for informing religion. I guess I'm kind of wandering around this question. Just get right to it. What are your thoughts on this new atheist movement and the old atheist movement? It seems to me that there's an evangelical atheist movement, which is functionally a religion, and then there are the people who we used to call agnostics, you know, who just kind of shrug their shoulders and go, I don't know. And that's really probably not a religion. That's just people who just genuinely don't know and they really don't care.
Well, look, I'm certainly not the first person to emphasize that there is something clearly fundamentalist about the new atheist movement, insofar as fundamentalism means a rigid adherence to a single notion of truth when confronted with a world of plurality. But more importantly, what the new atheist movement represents is not so much atheism as it is anti-theism. This notion of anti-theism, of course, is not a new one. The term itself goes all the way back to the 1830s, but it was really revived in the 20th century, and in particular post 9/11, to emphasize a new kind of radicalized anti-religious atheism. In other words, when someone like Richard Dawkins says, as he told the Humanist paper, that religion is one of the greatest evils in the world, comparable to smallpox. Or when Sam Harris recently said that, quote, if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of rape or religion, I wouldn't hesitate to get rid of religion. That's not just atheism. That's not just people saying there's no such thing as God. That is people espousing a view of religion as a pervasive, insidious evil that must be forcibly eradicated from society. That's what's new about what we see in some of these kinds of extremist atheist views from people like Harris and Dawkins. And the good news is that it's actually only a minuscule percentage of atheists in the country who actually follow these dictates. In fact, there was a wide-ranging poll done in the University of Tennessee that showed that only 15% of America's self-described atheists actually called themselves anti-theists. Now, you would know this if you saw the media or the bestseller list, which tend to be dominated by this anti-theistic voice. But like all, communities or groups, ethical groups, religious groups, belief systems, it's often the case that the loudest voice gets confused for the majority voice. That's not true in Islam, it's not true in Christianity, and it's not true in atheism either. And I say this for a very important reason, Tom, if I may, because my biggest beef with the so-called new atheists is that they give atheism a bad name. I mean, most of my intellectual heroes are all atheists, whether it's Schopenhauer or Feuerbach or Marx or Freud or even Huxley, who referred to himself as an agnostic. I think that what you're missing from the knee-jerk atheism of a Marr or a Dawkins or a Harris is a real grounding in philosophy, a real expertise in what religion is, its historical, sociological, philosophical influences, and how it's lived in the real world.
Yeah, and Huxley, in fact, I would argue, was a pretty aggressive mystic. He might not have been a theist, or a theist in the conventional sense.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, most people say that he was sort of most responsible for coining the phrase agnosticism. And again, that's another point, I think, as well, that is being missed by a lot of adherents to this so-called new atheism, is that they're confusing atheism with science. Atheism is a belief system like any other belief system, as hard as it is for a lot of atheists to understand that. I mean, it is a set of propositions about the nature of reality, a set of propositions that can be neither proven nor disproven. But at the same time, science is not an ideology, it's a methodology. And I think what is sometimes lost in the discussions with so-called new atheists, and again, I'm certainly not the first person to bring this up, is that it's less atheism than it is scientism. It's sort of an attempt to transform science into a new kind of religion, something to replace religion. And frankly, that should make most scientists scratch their heads, because that's not really the purpose of science at all.
Yeah, in one of those debates, I think it was with Sam Harris, I asked, when did you first begin to believe this to be true? And he was like, you're trying to catch me, this is not a belief. And I'm like, oh, well, how do you know it? Well, right. I know it because, well, and it turns out it's a belief. It's
scientifically proven.
Right, yeah. I've been having this running debate with atheists on my radio show now for 11 years.
Well, I think, if I can, so here's I think the principal fallacy here is that it's neither the case that science doesn't disprove theism. Science has really no opinion on the matter. It's simply a methodology for understanding the nature and function of the universe. Yeah. But more importantly, I think that this notion that there is an inherent conflict between theism and science, that if you believe in God, then you're by definition unscientific or irrational, is also quite absurd and irrational itself. And this is true even for the most orthodox versions of religion.
I agree. We'll pick this up
as easy as I could.
We have to pick this up on the other side. More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Reza Aslan after the break.
I'm Erin Eve. The financial world moves fast.
What kind of impact do you see these developments having on stocks?
The big banks will only take
There's
on
no
more
demand for credit. You're not going to get any economic benefit.
In life, there are booms and there are busts.
I'm the resident, and I know words are powerful. Words like cheap, as in people who buy the crap our media sells us are acting like a bunch of sheep. Or words like greedy, as in our entire financial system is rigged by a bunch of greedy jerks. Or words like consumers, as in there's more to life than just being gluttonous consumers. I'm the resident, and I'm fighting idiocy one carefully chosen word at a time.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy.
Covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America. Welcome back to tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. With me is Reza Aslan, professor, religious scholar, author of several books, including his most recent, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's get back to it. Just to wrap up this conversation on atheism, and we can leave it behind, I think, after that. You and Chris Stedman recently wrote an op-ed in which you suggested that atheists and Muslims should be having a conversation. You said it's time to stop shouting and start talking to each other. What do you mean by that? What kind of dialogue are you talking about here?
Well, you know, Chris is quite a prominent atheist activist, and he and I have been friends for a very long time because we have discovered, as most people who come from different religious backgrounds or ethnic communities or racial backgrounds often discover, is that when you get to know each other, what you find out is that you share pretty much the same values, that you may ground those values in a different language, you may use different symbols and metaphors to talk about the things that you believe, but in reality, how you see the world is not all that different. And for us, this was an attempt to indicate something that may come as a shock to a lot of people, which is how much Muslims and atheists have in common with each other in the United States. For instance, they both have actually similar numbers. About 2% of Americans called themselves atheists, and about 1% called themselves Muslim. They are both currently tied, if you can believe that, for the least favorably viewed groups in America, atheists and Muslims. And they are both, you know, quite marginalized in our larger discussion in a country in which 7 out of 10 Americans self-describe as Christian, in which Christianity oozes out of our very national culture. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, both groups seem to be somewhat dominated by extremists in their communities. I mean, if you turned on the television and watched the news and that's all you knew about Islam, all you would understand is violence and terror. And if you looked at the bestseller list, as I said, and if you looked at who's talking about atheism in the media, it tends to be precisely the anti-theists who represent very few atheists in this country, but who are clearly the loudest voices. And the argument that we were making is that by not speaking to each other, by continuing to look at one another as the enemy, all we are doing is actually encouraging the stereotypes that Americans have about both of our communities.
And which serves neither the purposes of neither group adequately.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely
Speaking
not.
of extremism, you brought that up. Let's talk about ISIS. President Obama went out of his way in his strategy speech recently to say that ISIS is not Islamic. Here's a clip from that.
Let's make two things clear. ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. And ISIL is certainly not a state. It was formerly al-Qaeda's affiliate in Iraq and has taken advantage of sectarian strife and Syria's civil war to gain territory on both sides of the Iraq-Syrian border.
First of all, thoughts on ISIL versus ISIS versus IS versus Islamic State. Is this just an evolutionary process in the media, or is there some consequential difference in these acronym characterizations for this group?
It's a very good question, Tom. Not consequential, but it is important perception-wise. ISIL is probably the most correct way of describing this organization, because they are not a state, nor do they have any kind of nationalist ambitions. They are not the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq. They are the Islamic State of Shams, which is what they refer to as this sort of greater Syria that includes all of what we would refer to as the Levant and Iraq. So in a sense, it's a reminder to us that this is an organization that doesn't have nationalist ambitions, they have global ambitions. And so that's important, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. But to the larger question that the president is making about the relationship between Islam and ISIS or ISIL, or however you want to refer to it, I think I understand and I completely sympathize with the desire for all people of faith, all communities of faith, to label extremists and radicals in their community as not them. I mean, Christians want to look at extremists and say, that's not really Christianity. Muslims look at extremists and say, well, that's not really Islam. And I understand where that sentiment comes from. And frankly, in the case of ISIS, you've got a good point. I mean, for instance, this latest statement by the organization that they are reviving slavery in the name of Islam is really difficult to reconcile with the fact that banning slavery was the first, literally the first thing that the Prophet Muhammad did when he created the Muslim community. But nevertheless, there is no Muslim Pope. There is no Muslim Vatican. There is no centralized religious authority that gets to define what is and what is not a proper Muslim behavior, who is and who is not a Muslim. And so it's just a simple fact that anyone who calls him or herself a Muslim is a Muslim. And anyone who says that they are doing something in the name of Islam, we should probably just take their word for it. Now, of course, considering the fact that the people that ISIS is killing are also Muslims, and that the people who are fighting against ISIS are also Muslim, ISIS's Islamic identity doesn't really say that much about Islam as a religion. But I do think it's important, particularly for Muslims, to stop rejecting ISIS's self-described identity as Muslims and to simply confront it, to face the reality of that as a virus within the Islamic community that needs to be rooted out. And I will just say one more thing, just because this is me as a religion scholar having to bring this up. It's just simply not the case that no religion condones the killing of innocents. Actually, every religion condones the killing of innocents. Every religion.
Right. And I'm doubtful about Buddhism. Has any war ever been declared in the name of Buddha?
Oh yes, there have been quite violent Buddhist kingdoms throughout the world, throughout history, but we don't need to go back to the ancient past. All we have to do is look at what's happening in Myanmar, in which you have Buddhist mobs, many of them led by Buddhist monks themselves, slaughtering Muslim Rohingya, as they're called, an ethnic community called the Rohingya, Rohingya women and children, and doing so as a religious duty, which is just a reminder to ourselves that religion is an ideology like any other. It can be bastardized and turned into extremism like any ideology can be, whether that ideology is religious or secular.
You suggested that Muslims, presumably of all stripes but of moderate tone, should confront the ISIL groups. Do you, as a virus, do you mean confront them theologically, confront them politically, confront them as if let's have a serious conversation, confront them as let's ridicule them? How do you do that?
All of that. Look, I mean, no one in their right mind, except for these sort of radical anti-theists that we were talking about earlier, thinks that ISIS or ISIL represents 1.6 billion Muslims around the world, the vast majority of Muslims. Whether they share certain matters of belief in common with ISIS or not, do not share its ideologies and do not condone its actions. To be perfectly honest, the truly remarkable thing about ISIS is how it has managed to unite the Muslim world against it in a way that nothing else has. We are seeing Sunni and Shia, the Saudis and the Iranians, Turks and Kurds, the Arab world and the Western world coming together, fighting on the same side against this menace, which, you know, would have been inconceivable a few years ago if you told me that those were the alliances that we were going to see on any subject today. But nevertheless, I think what is important is that by denying that ISIS has anything to do with Islam whatsoever, I think what we're doing is rejecting the notion that there is a very real problem, a virus of ultra-Orthodox fanaticism that has wormed its way into Islam, and in one particular region of the Muslim world, the greater Middle East, and that virus has a source. Its source is in Saudi Arabia. What we are talking about is a belief system called Salafism, or sometimes called Wahhabism, a belief system that was born in Saudi Arabia only about 150 years ago. This is not an ancient idea. It's quite a modern one. It has its roots in the 1850s, really, and which, thanks to tens of billions of dollars in Saudi evangelism, has rooted its way into almost every single Muslim community, not just in the Middle East, but also in places like Europe and even in North America. And so that is a problem that has to be rooted out. It has to be confronted. It has to be theologically confronted, certainly. It has to be politically confronted by governments in the U.S. and the European Union, which seem to turn a blind eye to the fanaticism of our close friends, the Saudis. And that confrontation is going to require an empowerment of the enormous, the vast majority of Muslim voices who have been already speaking out against ISIS and its atrocities, but whose voices seem to be drowned out by the much louder voices of extremism on one side and just frank bigotry on the other.
Yeah, we have just a little less than 2 minutes before the next break. In Saudi Arabia, there have been 59 beheadings so far this year, one for witchcraft. The vast majority, well, I believe pretty much all, well, maybe with one or two exceptions, of the people who were involved with 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. It was funded out of Saudi Arabia.
That's right, yeah, 15 of the 18. 15 of the 18.
Thank you. How is Saudi Wahhabism different from ISIS? I don't know if they call themselves Wahhabis or not, but from the ISIS theologically.
Yeah. Well, Wahhabism is a derogatory term, so they wouldn't refer to themselves that way. Outsiders refer to Wahhabis as Wahhabis, but the same ultra-Orthodox puritanical strain that is the state religion of Saudi is precisely what fuels ISIS. Now again, there is a huge difference between beliefs and actions, and hopefully when we come back from this break we can talk about what exactly that means, but nevertheless it's a fundamental fact that the belief system of Saudi Wahhabism is precisely the belief system that fuels the ideology of ISIS, and that it's just not enough to confront ISIS militarily. We have to confront that belief system not just by providing a counter belief system to it, but more importantly by turning off the spigot, if you will.
Yeah, and that goes back to the proverbial deal with the devil that the House of Saud made with Mr. Wahhab back some long time ago. We'll get to that
That's
after
right.
this.
That's right, in the 1830s,
Yeah.
right.
More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Reza Aslan right after the break.
Let's get something straight. John F. O'Donnell will do anything to piss off corporate vampires. Sam Sachs used to work on the Hill. Now he can smell a lobbyist from a mile away. Yeah, have a nice one. And I'm Lee Camp. I came here to throw truth in the faces of the powerful, because the truth is irresistible. Well, not to everyone.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
I would rather ask questions to people in positions of power instead of speaking on their behalf. And that's why you can find my show, Larry King Now, right here on RT. Question more.
Welcome back to tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. With me is Reza Aslan, professor, religious scholar, and author of several books, including his most recent, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's get back to it. Reza, just before the break, you mentioned the difference between practice and belief, and we were specifically talking about it in the context of Saudi Wahhabism and ISIL Wahhabism, or whatever they call that.
Yeah, this is a very important point, and one I think in which there is a great deal of confusion about, particularly, as I say, from critics of religion. I think that most people believe that there is a one-to-one correlation between belief and actions, that if you believe a certain thing, that you act necessarily on those beliefs. But any social scientist will tell you that that is simply not the case, that actions are the result of a whole host of complex negotiations that a person makes with the various facets of their identity, including their beliefs. But I think it's this confusion that leads so many people to say, well, the problem is belief, and that if we can just simply eradicate belief, then we wouldn't have problem with certain actions. Well, first of all, we can have a whole conversation about whether eradicating belief is even an issue, to be honest, is even a possibility. But more importantly, I think we have to understand that our problem with ISIS is not their belief system. Our problem is their actions. We are not at war with Wahhabism or Salafism, despite the fact that we may have an ideological conflict with it. We're at war with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, not because of what they happen to believe, but because what they are doing. It's their actions that we are condemning. Now, that is not to say that you can't criticize beliefs. Of course you can criticize beliefs, but nevertheless, a person is allowed to believe whatever that person wants to believe without being disdained for it, without being condemned or even harmed for it. That's how America works. That's what the modern world is supposed to be all about. It's when you take specific actions that violate the basic human rights of other people, that's when all people, believers and non-believers alike, must unite in condemning and taking forceful a response against those kinds of actions. Now, again, it's true that a lot of those actions are taking place in the Middle East. A lot of those actions are taking place in the name of Islam. Nobody should be denying that. But I think when you paint an entire belief system, an entire community of faith, with the same brush as its extremists, simply because of the fact that they may share certain beliefs in common with those extremists, it's not only an irrational thing to do, it's a dangerous thing to do, Tom. And it's dangerous for a very important reason. Because our greatest asset, the greatest tool in our fight against a group like ISIS, is precisely the vast majority of moderate Muslims who, again, may share some elements of belief, but who are absolutely repulsed by ISIS's actions. We need that counter narrative if we are going to defeat this force. But when we simply label all believers with the exact same brush, we alienate the moderates that we need on our side. We dismiss them, and we make them part of the problem instead of part of the solution.
It seems that the majority of the practicing extremists that we see are Sunni as opposed to Shia. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. And out of Sunni Saudi Arabia has come this strain of Salafism. You suggested they should be dialing that back. How would Saudi Arabia, after all these years, all these commitments, all this evangelism, all this money, generation after generation, how would they dial back Wahhabism? And similarly, in the Shia world, is there an analog to Salafism, and if so, where is that, and how does that get dialed back? I realize these are two very large questions.
So, no, it's a very smart question. Certainly there's no shortage of Shia extremism or Shia fundamentalism, but you're absolutely right that there is no analog in the Shia world to Salafism, for the simple fact that Salafism itself, Wahhabism itself, was originally created precisely to get rid of Shiism. This is a puritanical Sunni movement that sees any kind of innovation in Islam, particularly the Shiism, but also Sufi Islam and the whole host of various sects and schisms that one finds in the Islamic world, as anathema to Islam itself. As Puritans, what Salafists want to do is to strip Islam of those innovations and to return it to some kind of pure, unadulterated, and frankly, purely imaginary past. And so, yes, this is a Sunni movement. And what ISIS has done is carried out nothing short of a genocidal campaign against the Shia, and certainly against Christians and Yazidis as well. But it's the Shia that has really borne the brunt, not just of ISIS, but also of al-Qaeda, going all the way back to the Wahhabi fanatics that poured out of Saudi Arabia into Iraq at the end of the 19th century. So yes, this is an anti-Shia movement. It's Sunni Puritanism, and there is no real comparable movement like this in Shia Islam. There is no movement within Shia Islam that seeks to eradicate all Sunnis and to reconstitute the globe as a single Shia order. That just doesn't exist. To the other question about, well, what can Saudi do about it? Look, to their credit, I think that the Saudi government is starting to understand the beast that they have created. After all, they are just as much a victim of the Wahhabi Salafist movement that they themselves created and helped promulgate throughout the Muslim world as anybody else. As a matter of fact, the Saudi government, the Saudi regime, is in many ways enemy number one to groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS, simply because they are seen as apostates, as hypocrites who are in occupation of the most holy sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. But unfortunately, because the Saudi government and the almost infinite number of Saudi princes that are, if I can say crudely, sucking at the teat of the Saudi government, are impossible to control, we have still not done a good job at cutting off the supply of money, of funds, of support from prominent Saudi, wealthy, prominent Saudi individuals to these radical groups in the Middle East and in South Asia. And that is something that the Saudi regime has not really taken seriously enough. And I think that without the kind of external pressure from Europe and the United States, the Saudis simply won't do anything about it, because the internal politics, the domestic politics of Saudi Arabia really prohibit a full-throated attack against the very ideology that this government has based its very survival on, Wahhabism.
Would it be, I was going to say, would it be almost as if Jerry Falwell back in the day, you know, when he was palling around with Ronald Reagan and you know, being very, very partisan, if he had basically helped take over America and all of America's churches? But really, we have had an experience of this, and that was the Puritans and the Pilgrims when they basically got expelled from England in the 1600s and came to the United States. And Massachusetts, I mean, the big debates about whether Massachusetts could even be admitted into the United States in 1787, because they were still, you know, they were still persecuting witches and things like that. So we've sort of had a Christian variation of that in the United States. But how would you, is there an analog that you could use to describe this to people who are not well informed? They don't know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni, don't really understand Islam. They understand Christianity in the United States. They may know the difference between Protestant and Catholic.
Well, to your first point, I do want to say that while it is true that Puritanism is a universal religious phenomenon, all religions have within it communities that feel for one reason or another that their religion has been defiled somehow and they want to return it to some purified past. At the same time, there is no real moral equivalency between the Puritans who settled the United States and Puritans like ISIS, not because they believe different things, but because their actions are different, and so we should be very careful about any kind of comparison about the actions.
I believe it was Bradford who's attributed the "Shining City on the Hill" quote. When the Puritans organized the Pequot Massacre, where they got the forgetting the name of the other tribe that came along with them, they had made an alliance with one tribe of Native Americans. They encircled this Pequot village. Set it on fire. As men, women, children came out, they slaughtered them. The Indians that they had collaborated with were so horrified by this that they disavowed them forever. I mean, the Puritans were engaged in a number of massacres that were certainly not of the scale of ISIS, just because there weren't that many Puritans. I mean, there were only maybe 1,000 of them at the time in the United States.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's by no means to sort of deny that there were horrific actions caused by Puritans. I mean, even if you go back to the great reformers of Christianity, Martin Luther himself, who called for the slaughter of every man, woman, and child who joined the Peasants' Revolt of Thomas Münster. He said that their houses should be burned down. But again, it's a reminder to all of us that, number one, violence and religion go hand in hand in many ways, primarily because these are both powerful identity-forming mechanisms. The easiest way to figure out who is us and who is them, well, do you pray like us? Do you fast like us? Then you're us. If not, you're them. Perhaps the more easy way to actually define us and them is through violence. Are you wearing my uniform, or are you on my side of the trench? Then you're us. So this idea of religion and violence going hand in hand, that's just a fact. But that's not intrinsic to religion. It's intrinsic to humanity. I mean, to blame religion for religious violence would be akin to blaming nationalism for fascism. It's not religions that are violent or peaceful. It's people who are violent or peaceful, and people bring their own perceptions, their own ideologies, their own worldviews to every single belief system that they hold, regardless of what that belief system is.
And along with those things, their own particular cultural narratives and their own set of behaviors and standards, and this is acceptable and that's not, and this is over the top and that's, and these change over time and change with geography and everything else. More of tonight's conversations.
All the more reason why these generalizations that we hear about Islam in particular and religion in general are not just wrong, they're irrational, they're silly, they're childish.
They're nuts, yeah. More of tonight's conversations with great minds with Reza Aslan right after the break.
Dramas that can't be ignored.
Stories others refuse to notice. Faces changing the world right now. A full picture of today's news. Live, on demand, from around the globe. Rockley.tv.
Join me on Boom Bust for in-depth, impartial, and en vogue financial reporting, commentary, interviews, and much, much more. Only on Boom Bust and only on RT.
Welcome back to tonight's Conversations with Great Minds. Back with me is Reza Aslan, professor, religious scholar, and author of several books, including his most recent, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, and of course, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. Reza, your thoughts on President Obama's options and apparent strategy for dealing with ISIL?
Well, I think he's absolutely right that this is an organization that needs to be militarily confronted, not because it poses a threat, a direct threat at least, to American citizens or the homeland. I know of no national security expert who takes that idea seriously. It's pretty clear that that notion is something that is geared towards getting Americans to actually support military engagement with ISIS. I think it's important to militarily engage them because, as I say, they are in the midst of a genocidal campaign across Syria and Iraq. And if we are people who truly believe that the United States has the ability, the power, the responsibility to put an end to such campaigns wherever we see them, when we can, then certainly you should support this military engagement against ISIS. He should also, I think, be praised for managing to put together such an important and diverse coalition. I mean, the fact that we have the Arab League fighting on our side, that we have Saudis and Qataris and Bahrainis flying sorties over Iraq and Syria, the fact that we have Kurds and Turks fighting on the same side, despite the fact that these are two groups that have enormous suspicion of one another, that now even Turkey has decided that they will put aside their differences with the Kurds and actually engage ISIS, thanks to pressure from the Obama administration. These are all things that President Obama deserves an enormous amount of praise for. The question, of course, is it enough to do what he wanted to do, which is not just to degrade but to destroy ISIS? Again, that's a very difficult thing to sort of take seriously. Look, without any kind of boots on the ground, no matter how much we manage to push back the gains that ISIS has made, no matter how much we're able to degrade the things that they have done, we are not going to be able to destroy them, get rid of them, unless we actually have troops on the ground doing the fighting. Now, it seems fairly clear that at least under this administration, and certainly with the American mindset, those boots are not going to be American boots. We are not going to have American troops fighting ISIS in combat. But there are other troops at our disposal, and I'm not talking about the so-called Iraqi army, which despite I believe, $1 trillion in American taxpayer funds. It has been no use whatsoever in this campaign. I'm talking about Kurds, I'm talking about Iranians, actually, and perhaps, even if necessary, Syrian forces, not just the Free Syrian Army, those rebel movements that we can trust, but perhaps even the Syrian army itself, as loathsome as Assad may be, as difficult as it may be to think that we may have to actually work with him in the short term to get rid of this ISIS menace, we may have no choice in the matter. But the Iran thing is especially, I think, annoying for me. Iran has been fighting against ISIS before most Americans even knew what ISIS was. Iran actually does have boots on the ground in Iraq. Iran has a lot to lose. ISIS has set its sights on Tehran. This is a rabidly anti-Shia organization that wants to slaughter every Shia in the world. And to continue to pretend that the United States and Iran don't have a shared enemy, that there is no reason for them to coordinate with each other, is ludicrous and dangerous. And I know that it may be politically not very palatable for the president to admit that we need Iran in this one particular case, but we do. And if this menace is as great as the president keeps telling us it is, then it's time to set aside some of the petty disagreements that we have with some of our perceived enemies and work together, not just to defeat ISIS, but in hopes that at the very least this kind of cooperation could lead to even greater cooperation with other issues of importance, like Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a good friend who is a Sufi, Shia, Iranian ancestry, and who went to Iran recently and had lunch with President Rouhani. I can't imagine a mystic, of that kind of order going to Saudi Arabia and coming out with their head. Or into any of the Islamic world. One of the conversations that this friend of mine and I have had a number of times is, how do we, I would describe myself, I suppose, as a mystic, a Christian mystic, is how do we resacralize the world? It is almost, Dan Quinn brought a lot to this conversation a couple of decades ago with his Ishmael books. That, at least in terms of popular culture in the United States, the idea that there is the fire of life in everything, not just humans, not just things that seem to be animate, and that until we begin to view everything in creation, or everything at least that we have the ability to manipulate, as somehow sacred, we're going to continue to go down this road that could lead to the 6th great extinction. I mean, your thoughts on mysticism making the world sacred again, resacralizing the world, and the possible role that pantheism or some variation, some very subtle variation, that because I don't think anybody wants to be called a pantheist, but it seems to me like that's really the way to go. That worm and that tree are just as sacred as I am, and just as deserving of a right to be on this planet, and how do we all interact together and love and respect, and we're all made from the same fire of life, that kind of thing. Is this like, am I engaging in random, wild, totally blasphemous?
Not at all.
Go for it.
Not at all. Look, I think that it begins with recognizing something that mystics have always recognized, which is that religion is not faith, that these are two different things. Faith is indescribable, it's ineffable, it's utterly, quintessentially individualistic. Religion is nothing more than the language, a language made up of symbols and metaphors primarily, with which we describe faith. Faith itself is talking about something that is indescribable, inexpressible. Religion puts it into expressible terms. And that's what I think is important to understand. The Sufis have a great line. They say that don't confuse the path with the destination, that religion is nothing more than a signpost to God. It's not God itself. This is something that I think particularly adherents of monotheistic religions fail to grasp. I say that particularly monotheistic religions because if you believe that there is only one God, it's not such a great leap to then believe that there is only one path to that God, that there is only one truth. And if you believe that there is only one path, only one truth, what that seems to suggest is that any other path, any other claim to truth is not just wrong, it's anti-God, it's satanic, it's devil worship. It's a way of otherizing religious differences that has led to an enormous amount of conflict and bloodshed throughout religious history. Now, again, there's nothing unique about religion when it comes to violence. We will kill each other for any reason, be it tribe or ethnicity or nationality or culture or politics. Religion just happens to be another very good vehicle for death and destruction. But it is simultaneously a vehicle for love and peace and compassion. It is as responsible for good as it is for bad. And we who are people of faith have to recognize that the only antidote for religious violence is religious peace. The only antidote for religious misogyny or religious bigotry is religious feminism or religious pluralism. That to truly defeat religious extremism requires religious moderation, not the end of religion, again, which we so often hear from these kinds of unthinking critics of religion. We have been talking about the death of God for a very, very long time, and yet religion is arguably a greater force in the world today than it has been in centuries. At the beginning of the 20th century, 1/2 of the world's population defined itself as either Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or Buddhist. 100 years of secularism, of scientific advancement, of economic advancement, and that number is now 2/3. The world is becoming more religious, not less religious. We have to just face that reality and understand that simply saying, oh, well, because religion is sometimes responsible for great acts of evil, then what we really need to do is rid the world of religion. It's illogical, it makes no sense, and it doesn't work.
So if you agree with the premise, and I didn't hear whether you did or not, that mysticism might be the virus that can, you know, that can modify
the counter virus.
Yeah, there you go. How do we inject that into the world's religions, or does it just happen? I mean, where do we go with this? We just have 90 seconds. I'm sorry.
I think that, in a sense, it's already happening. I think that religion itself is being transformed by the world that we live in, by scientific progress, by the things that we understand. Yes, it's true that religion is still around, but what we call religion today is not what we called religion 200-300 years ago. And so I think that mysticism is becoming, I think, a genuine, viable alternative for people who want a faith experience, but who refuse to acknowledge these man-made institutions of religion. And as a mystic myself, I feel as though it provides a much greater sense of spiritual edification than any religious tradition can. I'll end with this one great quote from the Buddha himself. The Buddha said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells, you dig 1 6-foot well. So, pick a religion. That's your 6-foot well. That's fine. But understand that the water you are drinking from is the water that everybody is drinking from.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, in Christianity, Meister Eckhart and St. Francis and St. John of the Cross saved the religion, or at least provided a through line for it. And I see this in Sufism and Shia Islam. Anyway, I'm rambling here. Reza, thank you.
For another conversation.
Indeed. I so enjoy these conversations. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
It's my pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Reza Aslan. To see this and other Conversations with Great Minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com. And that's the way it is tonight, Monday, October 20th, 2014. And don't forget, democracy begins with you. Get out there, get active, tag You're It.